As 1941 came to an end, Hitler felt confident. Despite the Führer's hopes, however, Germany's victorious campaign through Europe and North Africa ended in 1942. The United States had entered the war, boosting the Allies' morale and strength. By the end of 1942, the combined resources, manpower, and wealth of the Allies would turn the tide of the war in their favor. On December 22, 1941, a few weeks after Pearl Harbor, Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt met to develop a joint war policy. Stalin had asked his allies to relieve German pressure on his armies in the east. He wanted them to open a second front in the west. A second front would split the German strength by forcing them to fight major battles in two regions instead of one. Churchill agreed with Stalin's strategy. He believed that the Allies should weaken Germany on two fronts before dealing a death blow. At first, Roosevelt was torn, but ultimately he agreed. Churchill thought that Northern Europe was too heavily defended for the Allies to attack in 1942. Instead, he argued that Britain and the United States should strike first at North Africa and Southern Europe, which he called the soft underbelly of Europe. This strategy angered Stalin, however, because he wanted the Allies to open the second front in France. In the meantime, the Soviet Union would have to hold out on its own against the Germans, with the help of some supplies from its partners. Nevertheless, late in 1942, the Allies began to turn the tide of war both in the Mediterranean and on the Eastern Front. As we saw earlier, the battle for North Africa went back and forth between Germany and Britain. German General Erwin Rommel won a major victory in June 1942 when he took the port city of Tobruk from the British. In response to this defeat, Britain sent one of its best generals, Bernard Montgomery, known as Monty to his men, to turn the tide. By this time, the Germans had advanced to an Egyptian village called El Alamein, west of Alexandria. They were dug in so well that British forces could not go around them, so Montgomery had to launch the Battle of El Alamein with a massive attack from the front. On the night of October 23rd, the roar of more than 1,700 British guns took the Axis soldiers totally by surprise. They fought back fiercely, but by November 3rd, Rommel's army had been beaten. He and his forces retreated westward. As Rommel retreated west, the Allies launched Operation Torch. On November 8th, an Allied force of more than 107,000 troops, most of whom were Americans, landed in Morocco and Algeria. This force was led by American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Caught between the two armies, Rommel's Africa Corps was finally smashed in May 1943. The loss of North Africa was a blow to Germany, but the most decisive defeat took place in the east. As we saw previously, the German offensive in Russia had stalled at Leningrad and Moscow. The Germans suffered heavy losses in battle and because of the Russian winter. When the summer of 1942 arrived, German forces were again on the move. Hitler sent his Sixth Army south to seize the rich oil fields in the Caucasus Mountains. The army was also to capture the strategic city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. With its 500,000 people, Stalingrad was a major industrial center. The Battle of Stalingrad began on August 23, 1942. The Luftwaffe went on nightly bombing raids that set much of the city ablaze and reduced the rest to rubble. The situation looked desperate. Nonetheless, Stalin had already told his commanders to defend the city named after him at all costs. Not one step backward, he ordered. By early November 1942, Germans controlled 90% of the ruined city. Then, another Russian winter set in. On November 19th, Soviet troops outside the city launched a massive counterattack. Closing in around Stalingrad, they trapped the Germans inside and cut off their supplies. Hitler's commander, General Friedrich von Paulus, begged him to order a retreat, but Hitler refused, saying the city was to be held at all costs. The Germans held on, but food and fuel began running out. On February 2, 1943, some 90,000 frostbitten, half-starved German troops surrendered to the Soviets. These pitiful survivors were all that remained of an army of 330,000. Stalingrad's defense had cost the Soviets over 1 million soldiers. The city they defended was 99% destroyed. After Stalingrad, however, the weakened Germans were on the defensive. The Soviets were able to steadily push German forces westward. As the Battle of Stalingrad raged, Stalin continued to urge the British and the Americans to invade France. In January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill met at Casablanca, Morocco. They still felt that they did not have enough manpower to break through the heavy German defenses in northern Europe. Instead, they decided to attack Italy first. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces of 180,000 soldiers landed on Sicily and captured it from Italian and German troops by August. The conquest of Sicily toppled Mussolini from power. On July 25th, King Victor Emmanuel III removed the dictator from office and had him arrested. On September 3rd, Italy surrendered. But the Germans seized control of northern Italy and put Mussolini back in charge. Finally, the Germans retreated northward, and the victorious Allies entered Rome on June 4th. Fighting in Italy, however, continued until Germany fell in May 1945. On April 28, 1945, as the Germans were retreating from northern Italy, the Italian resistance ambushed some trucks. Inside one of them, resistance fighters found Mussolini disguised as a German soldier. The following day, he was shot, and his body was hanged in the Milan town square. Wherever Allied forces fought, people on the home fronts rallied to support them. In war-torn countries like the Soviet Union or Great Britain, civilians lost their lives and endured extreme hardships. Except for a few of its territories, such as Hawaii, the United States did not suffer invasion or bombing. Nonetheless, Americans at home made a crucial contribution to the Allied war effort. Americans produced the weapons and equipment that would help win the war. Defeating the Axis powers required mobilizing for total war. In the United States, factories converted their peacetime operations to wartime production and made everything from machine guns to boots. Automobile factories produced tanks. A U.S. typewriter company made armor-piercing shells. By 1944, almost 18 million U.S. workers, many of them women, were working in war industries. As in World War I, women made a significant contribution to the war effort by becoming factory workers. With factories turning out products for the war, a shortage of consumer goods hit the United States. From meat and sugar to tires and gasoline, from nylon stockings to laundry soap, the American government rationed scarce items. Setting the speed limit at 35 miles per hour also helped to save on gasoline and rubber. In European countries directly affected by the war, rationing was even more drastic. To inspire their people to greater efforts, Allied governments conducted highly effective propaganda campaigns. These campaigns used all the tools of modern mass media, including film, posters, and radio programs, to convince people to support the war effort. While the Allies were dealing with issues on the home front, they were preparing to push toward victory in Europe. By the end of 1942, the war had begun to turn in favor of the Allies. By 1943, the Allies began secretly building a force in Great Britain. The Allied plan was to attack German-occupied France across the English Channel. By May 1944, the invasion force was ready. Thousands of planes, ships, tanks, landing craft, and 3.5 million troops awaited orders to attack. American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the commander of this enormous force, planned to strike on the coast of Normandy in northwestern France. The Germans knew that an attack was coming, but they did not know where it would be launched. To keep Hitler guessing, the Allies set up a huge dummy army with its own headquarters and equipment. They ordered the make-believe army to attack at the French seaport of Calais. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy was the greatest land and sea attack in history. The date chosen for the invasion to begin was June 6, 1944, known today as D-Day. At dawn on June 6th, British, American, French, and Canadian troops fought their way onto a 60-mile stretch of beach in Normandy. The Germans had dug in with machine guns, rocket launchers, and cannons. They protected themselves behind concrete walls 3 feet thick. Among the Americans alone, 3,000 soldiers died on the beach that day. Captain Joseph Dawson said, "The beach was a total chaos, with men's bodies everywhere, with wounded men crying both in the water and on the shingle." Despite heavy casualties, the Allies held the beachheads. A month later, more than 1 million additional troops had landed. On July 25th, the Allies punched a hole in the German defenses near the French town of St. Lo. General George Patton, one of America's best generals and a genius in tank warfare, commanded the American Third Army that broke through the German lines and opened the way into France. The Germans retreated before the Allied invaders. On August 25th, the Allies marched triumphantly into Paris. By September, they had liberated France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and much of the Netherlands. They then set their sights on Germany. As Allied forces moved toward Germany from the west, the Soviet army was advancing toward Germany from the east. Hitler now faced a war on two fronts. In a desperate gamble, the Führer decided to counterattack on the west. He hoped a decisive victory in the west would split American and British forces and break up Allied supply lines. Explaining the reasoning behind his plan, Hitler said, "This battle is to decide whether we shall live or die. All resistance must be broken in a wave of terror." On December 16th, German tanks broke through weak American defenses along an 85-mile front in the Ardennes. This push deep into the Allied lines gave the campaign its name, the Battle of the Bulge. Although caught off guard, the Allies eventually regrouped and pushed the Germans back. Allied air power and a lack of supplies, especially fuel, contributed greatly to the German defeat. German forces could do little but retreat, since Hitler had now lost men that he could no longer replace. After the Battle of the Bulge, the war in Europe neared its end. In late March 1945, the Allies rolled across the Rhine River into Germany. By the middle of April, a noose was closing around Berlin. 3 million Allied soldiers approached Berlin from the southwest. 6 million Soviet troops approached from the east, some of them just 40 miles from the capital. By April 25, 1945, the Soviets had surrounded the German capital of Berlin. Their artillery and aircraft pounded the city. While Soviet shells burst over Berlin, Hitler prepared for his end in an underground headquarters beneath the crumbling city. On April 28th, he married his longtime companion, Eva Braun. That same day, he wrote his final address to the German people. In it, he blamed Jews for starting the war and his generals for losing it. "I myself and my wife choose to die in order to escape the disgrace of capitulation," he said. "I die with a happy heart, aware of the immeasurable deeds of our soldiers at the front." 2 days later, on April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. On May 7, 1945, General Eisenhower accepted the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich from the German military. President Roosevelt, however, did not live to witness the long-awaited victory. He had died suddenly on April 12th as Allied armies were advancing toward Berlin. Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, received the news of the Nazi surrender. On May 8th, the surrender was officially signed in Berlin. The United States and other Allied powers celebrated what became known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe had ended at last. Although the war in Europe was over, the Allies were still fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. With the Allied victory at Guadalcanal, however, the Japanese advances in the Pacific had been stopped. For the rest of the war, the Japanese retreated before the counterattack of the Allied powers. By the fall of 1944, the Allies were moving in on Japan. In October, Allied forces landed on the island of Leyte in the Philippines. General MacArthur, who had been forced to surrender the islands in February 1942, waded ashore. He then declared, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." Actually, the battle would not be quite that easy. The Japanese had decided to destroy the American fleet so that the Allies could not resupply their ground troops. To carry out this strategy, the Japanese had to risk almost their entire fleet. They gambled everything on October 23rd in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Within 3 days, however, the Japanese Navy had lost disastrously, virtually eliminating it as a fighting force in the war. Now only the Japanese army stood between the Allies and Japan. The battle for the Philippines saw the introduction of a terrible new weapon by the Japanese, the kamikaze. The kamikaze were Japanese suicide pilots. They would sink Allied ships by crash diving into them with planes loaded with bombs and explosives. Although they ultimately did not save Japan, The kamikaze did a lot of damage to the Allied forces in the last months of the war. After the Philippines, the next targets in the Allied island-hopping campaign were the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Iwo Jima was a small rocky island about 660 miles from Japan. It would be an ideal location for an air base to launch strikes against Japan. Okinawa was a larger island only about 350 miles south of Japan. It would provide an essential base to store supplies and prepare for an invasion of the Japanese islands. Both Iwo Jima and Okinawa were heavily defended by thousands of Japanese troops, who had dug into caves and bunkers and covered the islands with explosive mines and deadly traps. In March 1945, after a month of bitter fighting and heavy losses, American Marines took Iwo Jima. On April 1st, U.S. troops moved to the nearby island of Okinawa, only about 350 miles from southern Japan. The Japanese put up a desperate fight. Nevertheless, on June 22nd, the bloodiest land battle of the war ended. The Japanese lost 110,000 troops, and the Americans 12,500. After Okinawa, the next stop had to be Japan. President Truman's advisors had informed him that an invasion of the Japanese homeland could take months to complete and might cost 500,000 Allied lives and possibly millions of Japanese lives. A quicker way to end the war might be possible, however, using a powerful new secret weapon called the atomic bomb, or A-bomb. The atomic bomb had been developed by the top-secret Manhattan Project, headed by General Leslie Groves and Chief Scientist Robert J. Oppenheimer. Truman only learned of the new bomb's existence when he became president. The first atomic bomb was successfully exploded in a desert in New Mexico on July 16, 1945. The weapon was so powerful that American military leaders were sure its use against Japan would cause that country to surrender immediately. President Truman warned the Japanese. He told them that unless they surrendered, they could expect a rain of ruin from the air. The Japanese did not reply. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a Japanese city of 365,000 people. Almost 73,000 people died in the attack. When the Japanese still refused to surrender, a second bomb was dropped 3 days later on August 9th on Nagasaki, a city of 200,000. It killed about 37,500 people. Radiation from the bombs killed many more people over the following years. After the destruction of Nagasaki, the Japanese finally gave in. On September 2nd, Japanese leaders surrendered to General Douglas MacArthur. The surrender took place aboard the United States battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. With Japan's surrender, the war had ended. Now, countries faced the task of rebuilding a war-torn world.